Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Invisible Rules book launch by Niagara University in Ontario. Thank you for joining us to celebrate the book, the authors, and the leaders whose voices are heard in this delightful read. The importance of gender equity cannot be understated. Women represent half of the world's population, and therefore at least half of its potential. Taking steps to decrease gender inequity in the workplace, such as promoting women's leadership, could benefit Canada's economy by as much as $150 billion by 2026. McKinsey Global Institute report suggests that if we eliminate the gender gap, that number could rise as high as $420 billion. Despite these projections, today gender inequity continues to persist everywhere, stagnating social progress and reducing organization potential earnings. Today, together with the authors, leaders, and the guests, we take one step closer to changing tomorrow's landscape of gender equity. My name is Galina Bayarintseva, and I'm an assistant professor of management at Niagara University in Ontario, and your host and the moderator for today's event. It is a great honor for me to be here tonight and to share this evening with you. Without further ado, let me introduce our distinguished panelists and guests. We're joined today by, of course, the authors of the book, Dr. Paul Harrietta and Dr. Holly Catalfano. Also with us are Brian Schiffman, the president and the CEO of the Vaughan's Chamber of Commerce, Christine McGee, a person whose voice you know very well, as it has been on the radio for the last 20 years, the president and the co-founder of Sleep Country Canada, Michelle Bannick, the corporate director and former chief people officer at Omers, one of Canada's largest defined benefit pension plans, Zabin Hirji, an executive advisor at Deloitte, also former chief human resource officer at the Royal Bank of Canada. Last but not least, Diana Isaac, a partner at the law firm of Shulman & Partners, one of the largest Toronto family law practices. At this moment, I would like to introduce and invite Dr. Vince Rinaldo, the Vice President of Niagara University in Ontario, to extend his welcome to our panel and our guests.
Thank you, Galina. On behalf of the Reverend James J. Marr, 26th President of Niagara University, and Dr. Deborah Colley, the Executive Vice President, I would like to welcome our guests and distinguished panel to this evening's event. Niagara University has a 165-year legacy of excellence that began from a small campus located on Monteagle Ridge and now extends across Ontario to include the newest site in Vaughan. Niagara's mission is housed within the Catholic intellectual tradition that emphasizes reverence for human dignity and provides a holistic perspective of truth that invites us to intellectually explore meaning beyond the confines of self in order that we can productively contribute to the community as a whole. As a Vincentian institution, we are called in action by dealing with matters of social injustice that will result in sustainable systemic change. In that spirit, I would like to welcome you and invite you all to become a part of this change. Niagara University in Ontario is located in Vaughan, and with that, we would like to share a communication from the Mayor, His Worship Maurizio Bevilacqua. Galina? And now to say a few words on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce, the President and Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Brian Schiffman.
Thanks a lot, Vince. And Galina, thanks also for including me, and congratulations to Niagara University for bringing this forward. You know, as the President and CEO of the Vaughan Chamber, and a very large chamber in Canada, I ask why do we have a man as President and CEO? Why is he bringing remarks? And I just say that I think it's important that we include everyone at the table to address some long-term inequity. And I'm going to give just a few remarks about the impact that COVID has had on women in particular, disproportionate impact. Before I do that, I want to shout out Paul and Holly A really powerful book, very impressive, very important. Paul was a very important guest for a women's symposium that the Vaughan Chamber ran. We do the largest women's symposium in York Region every year. This year, of course, we did it virtually. And we actually had two guests with Niagara University, and both Paul and Lubna, who's a student at Niagara and was so well spoken on our youth panel. I'm not going to talk long because this has just been such an incredible panel, and I think that's what everybody's here to see. So my only comments would be two. The first one is I was looking at the book. I think that something very important, I'm not surprised, but disappointed by it. You see it in the front cover, on the inside cover. It says, it comes as no real surprise that women today hold only 10% of the highest paying jobs in corporate Canada. This is no surprise. In fact, nationally, only 4% of skilled trades are women. And that was before the pandemic. So I imagine that's even worse now. We can do a lot better together. The other thing is the Vaughan Chamber of Commerce and our chamber colleagues have been at the forefront of talking about the disproportionate impact that COVID's had on women. There was a She Covery report, and I'll just read you just a quick excerpt, gives a little bit of context for today. Several reasons for the disproportionate impact on women. First, temporary business shutdowns and layoffs during the state of emergency most severely affected occupations and sectors that predominantly employ women. Second, these sectors are those in which women entrepreneurs are more likely to operate, and their businesses tend to be newer, smaller, and less well-financed than those owned by men. Third, restrictions on schools and paid childcare facilities have shifted additional hours of unpaid family care onto parents, and this work has largely been taken up by mothers. And fourth, while women are dominating the frontline responses to the COVID pandemic, they have not been included in the planning for recovery. So I just wanted you to know we always stand by Niagara University. This is a very important topic. And thank you all to the panelists for being here. I look forward to listening and much appreciated.
Thank you, Brian. Prior to my administrative role, I was a professor in the Department of Advanced Studies and faculty member in Niagara's PhD program in leadership and policy. And it was in that role that I first met Paul and Holly. As a dissertation advisor, I was fortunate to work with students as they added to the intellectual knowledge base of the Academy. Tonight, we're fortunate that Paul and Holly didn't stop there. There needed to be a call to action, a societal contribution. By developing this dissertation into a book, The Invisible Rules, what's really holding women back in business and how to fix it. They brought this to a very important public image and public level. And it's with great pride that I introduce the authors, Dr. Paul Henrietta and Dr. Holly Catalfamo.
Thank you very much, Vince. On behalf of my talented co-author, Holly, I want to welcome to all of you to the formal launch of The Invisible Rules. I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening. And we'd also like to extend our sincere appreciation to Niagara University in Ontario and Shulman and Partners LLP for arranging and hosting this special event. This is a bit of a homecoming for me as a proud Niagara University alum. As Vince mentioned, The Invisible Rules actually began life as a PhD thesis. It was influenced significantly by the university's Vincentian ideals of charity, service, and inclusion. As doctoral students, we were advised from day one that our scholarship should focus on issues of social justice and that our work should, ideally, seek to enhance the fortunes of a given community, big or small, local or universal. And that was certainly the intent of this study, to shed added light on the gender equity gap that persists in corporate Canada, especially at senior leadership levels, while exploring workable ways to fix the problem sooner rather than later. Now, our sincere hope is that this session and influencers like you will help to move the needle on gender equity just a little bit. We appreciate your support and invite all of you sincerely to join the cause. Most of you already have. So given that this is a book launch, I'd like to start with a short reading from the opening pages of The Invisible Rules. I think it'll help to set the stage. Like it or not, There are two sets of rules that govern employment practices in corporate Canada. One for men and one set for women. One set that continues to preserve a long-standing male power structure by assuring that the disproportionate number of men achieve senior leadership status, and a second set of powerful, deeply rooted, and largely imperceptible rules that make the pursuit of senior leadership far more demanding and uncertain for aspiring women. Men get to be men. In a form of corporate Darwinism, women must adapt or die from a career perspective. While we might not be aware of these invisible rules, their devastating impact remains pretty obvious. We see highly qualified and ambitious women enter the workforce, all charged up and ready to change the world, only to be disappointed as they watch male colleagues pass them on the climb up the corporate ladder. And we see these frustrated women abandon traditional workplace pipelines in droves to start small businesses, join early stage companies, lead not-for-profits, or leave the workforce altogether. Little wonder, as Brian pointed out, that women hold only about 10% of the highest paying jobs at Canada's largest publicly traded companies. Despite the honorable efforts of strong advocates, allies, and supporting organizations, the pursuit of gender equity in Canada has moved at a glacial pace. Sure, we've seen lots of positive change over the past 50 years, but we still have a very long way to go. By any reasonable measure, women remain dramatically underrepresented at senior leadership levels in Canada, and this inequity is tough on women. And as Canadian business icon Annette Verschuren tells us, it impacts Canada's and impedes corporate Canada's ability to compete head-to-head with progressive economies worldwide. Quote, "Gender equity is a fundamental business issue. We need to understand that diversity of thought is no longer a luxury for organizations who want to compete internationally or globally. To ensure success, organizations must adjust to the needs and perspectives of the women and other diverse candidates who will ultimately drive their success. It's hard to lead the way when you systematically marginalize 50% of your best talent." We hope to change that. This book exposes the invisible rules and makes it easier for women to get ahead. More to the point, it will help senior leaders and senior male leaders in particular better understand the negative impact that their attitudes and actions continue to have on so many talented and ambitious women. Unintentional perhaps, but undeniable and increasingly indefensible. Let's face it, gender equity isn't a women's problem or issue. If women alone could fix it, they would have done so a long time ago. This is a business problem and opportunity that men and women can and must tackle together. When I tell people about the book, they invariably ask a pretty blunt but reasonable question. Given all of the social justice issues that I could have tackled, why is a white male ex-CEO in his late 50s interested in gender equity in the workplace? Fair enough. My interest in gender equity was actually inspired by my wonderful wife, Mary, and her experiences as an aspiring leader in the early 2000s. Like so many talented women, Mare plateaued professionally at a senior management level for an extended period during her mid-career, despite consistently superior performance reviews and promises of future advancement. She and her female colleagues watched as male peers, less qualified and younger in many instances, were promoted to senior leadership roles based on potential and self-promotion rather than proven performance. It was frustrating and in many cases soul-destroying. It's little wonder that so many talented women self-selected out of the pipeline. Others, like Mary, kept pushing and ultimately achieved leadership status, albeit at a different organization. It's a good news story in many respects, but it's safe to say that her path to senior leadership took way more time and effort than it should have, and certainly would have had she been a man. So when the time came to write my PhD thesis, I decided to tackle the gender equity issue head on and explore two fundamental questions. One, why do women remain so badly underrepresented at the top of corporate Canada? And two, how can we fix the situation? Now, to find the answers, Holly and I went straight to the source. We interviewed 50 female executives, included some of the highest profile leaders in the country, and you'll hear from 3 of them this evening: Christine McGee, Zabine Hergy, and Michelle Bannock, along with our special guest, Diana Isaac. Now, based directly on the rich and highly consistent feedback we received during the interviews, Holly and I were able to identify the invisible rules that continue to hold women back in business, develop an academically sound 4-step blueprint for career advancement, and codify a number of essential strategies that organizations can use to achieve gender equity sooner rather than later, including the potential use of formal quotas. Holly will expand on our key findings in just a minute, but before I hand things over to her, I want to acknowledge that the research also opened my eyes as a man and prompted me to confront some of my own deeply ingrained biases and resulting behaviors. What I learned through the process is that most male leaders, like me, remain oblivious to the invisible rules that continue to hold women back. They're largely unaware of their personal gender-based biases, the overwhelming tendency for like to hire like, and the considerable disadvantages that the lack of awareness creates for aspiring female leaders. In the wise words of Ruth Brothers, one of our leaders, when it comes to gender equity, women need coaching, but men need education, which of course is where the book comes in. This is our collective opportunity to spread the word, to help build essential awareness, equip aspiring female leaders to ascend the corporate staircase, and ultimately inspire leaders, and male leaders in particular, to make gender equity a business priority, and for all the right reasons. Fingers crossed, and on that optimistic note, I'd like to hand things over to Holly.
Thanks so much, Paul. I want to thank everybody for the amazing introduction, and a special thanks to Galina and Diana for hosting this evening. And to everybody out there, thank you so much for joining us. I am so honored, and I know Paul is as well. We're so honored that you've joined us tonight. It's such a special evening for us all. I also would like to thank our 50 remarkable leaders, including Zabine and Christine and Michelle, who've helped make the invisible rules a reality, and also for helping to inspire the next generation of female leaders. I would also like to start with a story from the book. And this is a true story from one of our leaders. It was just another day at a leading Canadian organization. The company's senior executive team had gathered for a standard monthly planning session to discuss, among other things, succession plans and staff allocation, things that I get excited about. The intent was to ensure that A, the individual leaders had sufficient resources, including staff, to deliver their business commitments for the remainder of the year. And B, to ensure that high potential staff members were receiving appropriate developmental opportunities. Now, midway through the meeting, a newly appointed female member of the senior executive team stated bluntly and emphatically that she did not want to hire a certain high potential female assigned to her team because despite her excellent credentials and an amazing work ethic, she was likely to get pregnant again in the next year or so. Now, the executive, herself a mother of young children, rationalized her position and said, well, the disruption would cause so much impact on client relationships and it was going to require so much time and energy on her part, it would be just too difficult. The bottom line, a potential maternity leave was an inconvenience. Well, you could have heard a pin drop. The uncomfortable silence that followed was finally interrupted by one of the male executives who stated quietly, but matter-of-factly, discriminating against a former employee, a female employee, or any employee for that matter, because of parental choices was totally unacceptable. He also noted that the sentiment was particularly disturbing, coming from a female executive who herself had taken 2 separate year-long mat leaves while successfully pursuing her senior executive position. So what's so compelling to me about this leader's story is, like so many of the stories in the book, is how relatable it is to so many people. And quite honestly, to me, a number of people have asked me, why this particular project? What fueled your passion to work on a project around gender equity? And my motivation comes not only from my experience as an HR professional, but also from personal experiences. Early in my career, as an aspiring young leader, one of my managers, who happened to be female, asked me why I had applied for a promotion when I had little ones at home. And she was the hiring manager. I don't suppose that the other candidate who had been shortlisted, a male who also had small children at home, had been asked that same question. And in fact, I'm sure he hadn't. Of course, that's only one of the many biases that so many women face during their leadership journey. Throughout my career, I've observed many inequities, but many of which were unintentional. But nonetheless, these inequities stifled the careers of incredibly brilliant women who faced the invisible rules that are holding women back from achieving their dreams. Now, working with Paul, I found an amazing opportunity to share their voices and hopefully to make a difference in this space. Now, I am going to beg your indulgence while I share some of the highlights of the important concepts we explore in the Invisible Rules, including the 4 common biases that women face, the CAPS model, which provides a framework of the key strategies or factors that our 50 leaders attributed to their success, and will provide a high-level overview of the solutions that organizations really must consider in order to address gender inequities in their workplaces. Now, our leaders identified 4 consistent factors that made it harder for them to compete directly with men for senior leadership positions. Now, these biases include, first, a general need to outperform men on a sustained basis, often referred to as the prove it again bias. Secondly, the need to choose between likability and leadership, the tightrope. The demands women face with respect to domestic responsibilities and motherhood, referred to as the maternal wall, and a subtle tendency for some women to judge one another in the workplace, a tug of war. Now, our leaders also shared with us how they were able to navigate the invisible rules and those big biases during their climb up the corporate ladder. They attributed their successes to credentials, adaptability, profile, and support, which we affectionately refer to as the CAPS model. Now, strong credentials give women credibility and a voice at the table. Credentials are the ticket to the dance. Adaptability provides women with the ability to balance stereotypically assertive behaviors, think male, with communal behaviors, think female. Now, as our leaders told us, adaptability is not always easy, but it's absolutely critical. Our leaders also spoke of the need to cultivate a strong profile or personal brand. And finally, they shared that their successes would not have been possible without considerable levels of support coming from their partners and their families, outsourced support, supportive workplaces, and of course, sponsorship. Individuals in their worlds that were willing to showcase their considerable talents and abilities. Now, we'd like also to share some initial thoughts on how to level the playing field, according to our leaders. Now, their recommendations include a wide range of insights, but it starts with gaining genuine leadership commitment from those at the top of organizations. We need to build real awareness of the issues that aspiring female leaders face. And we have to review and challenge and change talent management practices to ensure that they are genuinely inclusive. And it goes without saying, we have to look at compensation practices, the pay gap that continues to perpetuate inequities in Canada and across the world. And finally, organizations really need to rethink those workplace practices that provide genuine flexibility. We have to stop measuring outcomes in terms of when do you clock in and when do you clock out. We have to look at the outcomes of the work. And surely the pandemic has demonstrated that workplace flexibility is achievable. I've said this before, it's really a no-brainer. Now, I will leave the discussion of quotas for another day and another time. However, Paul and I both agree it's definitely worth the conversation. I'd like to leave you with this thought, and I want to emphasize something that Paul has already mentioned. As you know, gender equity is no easy task, but it shouldn't be seen as a women's issue because it's a business issue, and it really needs to be addressed as such. It's not something women can fix all on their own, because if they could have, it would have been fixed a long time ago. It's time for men to make gender equity a business priority. Good intentions aside, nothing gets done when only half of the population wants it to get done. I want to thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Galina, and I am so excited to hear from our incredible panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul and Holly. Having a read from the authors is such a thrilling experience, like having them read to you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your stories and your thoughts on gender equity. At this point of time, I would like to turn our attention to our panelists. But before we do, I would like to mention that we will have a 15-minute Q&A at the end of the session. And please, if you have a question, post your question in the Q&A at the bottom of Zoom, and we'll address your questions, as many as we can. So I would like to start with the first questions for Christine McGee. Christine, in one of the first quotes in the book, you shared that, and I'm reading, women tend to be more reflective than men, which is often perceived to be a weakness in the workplace. And picking on what Paul and Holly said before, aside from this troubling misconception, why in general terms do you think women continue to be so poorly represented at the high corporate levels in Canada?
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Galina, for the opportunity to be a panelist this evening. Congratulations, by the way, Holly and Paul, also on the launch of Invisible Rules. You know, the question is complex, and it took about 220 pages of the book to actually examine and explore that. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give it particular justice in the next couple of minutes, but I think there are a couple of key points in the Invisible Rules that nicely articulates the reason that as women, we continue to be underrepresented at the senior levels in corporate Canada, despite the fact that we have 50% of the population. You know, I support the notion that in the book that it's not malicious or malintent, which I think in itself is pretty hopeful, by the way. And I think it's also important to remember, but rather it's born out of systemic and traditional working norms that require us to break down conscious and unconscious bias and preconceived notions of what we as women are capable of, and also what we aspire to become. I would purport that not necessarily all of us yet are really comfortable saying we want to be CEOs. It might be because of modesty. It may be because we're worried about what people will say. But I think often we would rather earn it and then say it, and then work towards it. And so I do think we may need to think about that too, as well in our dialogue. But I really liked the 7 individual invisible rules and 4 big biases facing women that the book spoke to. Holly spoke to the one that I wanted to chat about, which is the prove it again, you know, and again before you get the job and the opportunity. I did feel that, by the way, during my career in the banking industry, which was a long time ago. I do feel that I had to be better than my male counterpart just to get the opportunity. I used to liken it to working out with weights. It just kind of made me stronger. But I think what was equally telling was that my performance was also met by a surprised acknowledgement that, you know, by my male colleagues that, in fact, I was good. Like, wow, she is smart, right? What a surprise. So I think women continue to suffer from that very basic challenge of opportunity that we've talked about so far. The notion that people hire and promote based on a predilection to pick a version of yourself, I think, is a really interesting concept that the book explores. To have a male leader have the confidence to hire the person who is different, to take a risk, and then to set up a system of support and time to truly mentor and develop that person. It's not always the obvious or easy choice. Increasingly, I think as organizations and individuals within organizations truly come to understand that diversity improves performance, I think that'll help break the cycle. But, I also believe that as women, we need to be ready. When the opportunity presents itself, we need to walk through that door and not think about the reasons that we're not ready. No one is ever ready, right? But it is believing that we will make it once we have the chance. That's really critical, I think. When I started Sleep Country, I could have come up with lots of reasons not to do it. And at 34, there were some real personal and professional risks that had to be weighed. I think if we believe we're ready to be given the chance, then others begin to believe it as well. I think as women, we do need to raise our hand. We need to lean in, that number 2 of those invisible rules. Sabine and I had this very conversation a few weeks ago. I think that when we talked about not being heard, or maybe sometimes we were too careful in weighing in or sharing our opinions. I don't think either of us would be accused of shrinking violets, but even us, we have to be reminded that we need to lean in. So that's what I liked about Holly and Paul's book. I think it really does capture the challenges and the complexities women face and how they navigate their careers, and I do think that the CAPS framework is a real credible tool.
Thank you very much, Christine. Very insightful. I think I would like to build a little bit more on this. And the gender equity is not novel for Canada, nor for the rest of the world, if I may say. As recently as March 8th, I was looking through the paper, and the Global News published the results of a recent poll suggesting that most Canadians believe there's still a long way to go to achieve gender equity in this country. However, when you look closer, and I'm an academic, I always look close, it's more women than men that think that the equity remains elusive in a host of fields. So I would like to ask, and I think I want to pose this question for Sabine. Sabine, why, in your opinion, in the 21st century, we continue to see this poll results, and why the conversation of gender equity has to be at the forefront of our talks with each other and with the leaders?
Thank you, Galina, and thanks to everyone for inviting me to be a part of this really important conversation. It's not surprising to me, I will be honest, the poll results that women and men see things differently. I think we see that with most underrepresented groups. You'll see that gap. And one of the takeaways for me here is that the data is there. We don't need more data. You've all shared a lot of research, a lot of data, but fundamentally to me, it comes down to this belief that as human beings, male, female, different races, different ethnicities, we all have the same potential. The difference is we're not given that opportunity to unlock that potential. And the barriers that are faced that go beyond the workplace, many of these start very early on, really are the things that keep us behind. So I would say, let's use the data we have already, but let's not go off looking for more. What's missing for me, perhaps, is that this data needs to be made real. What I would often hear at my time at RBC was, but Sabine, this doesn't happen in our company, does it? When you saw data. Well, of course it does. We are all microcosms of society. So how do you take that and how do you have the conversations within the organization that make it real, that really hit home and get to the heart? The data gets to the head, and that's important. And can we build on some of the successes, the early successes we're seeing around these courageous conversations? We're having them around race much more than we ever did before. But what I have found is that what really changes mindsets, what changes behavior, is when you get to the heart. And while it's difficult to tell stories, because the challenge there is you're putting the onus on the women to tell their stories, but I do think it's powerful. And I found in my career, when I expressed to people and shared to people my experiences at RBC, people were shocked. And yes, I had a successful career, but what you go through to get there is something that needs to be talked about more. So my sort of bottom line here in terms of how do we make that change and put it at the forefront is that we marry the hard stuff, the data, with the soft stuff, and start to make it real. And I think we'll get more traction and more inspiration for CEOs and other leaders to make change.
Thank you, Sabine. Sharing stories, I think this is probably one of the hardest things to do, right? The ability to talk, to speak up, and speak about the vulnerabilities, but yet so important. Michelle, would you like to add to this?
Oh, absolutely. And thank you all for having me here. And Paul and Holly, congratulations on the book launch. I'm thrilled to be here. Just building on Sabine's comments, the topic of gender equity has to remain at the forefront of our conversations because we're not making enough progress. In fact, frankly, I feel like we're stuck. Earlier in my career, I would have believed that this was a generational issue. I would have thought, absolutely, we'll be making the right level of progress. How could we not? But as I advanced in my career and saw fewer and fewer women around me, I started to realize that something different had to be at play here. And so, as Sabine said, we clearly need to take a look at the data in a different way, and the conversations need to surface. There's structural elements at play here that are contributing to the uneven playing field. And I think we're going to need a real concerted effort and focus to see real change. And I'd say we also have the language to raise these issues differently now. And our organizational behavioral scholars, like we always have the language, but those of us in the corporate world are having that language, surfacing that language in a different way. And I think that that's creating an impatience for change that is now being felt in organizations. And so really time for us to harness that. And an impatience, frankly, that I'm quite happy with, because to really see the change, it can't be a seasonal effort, because that's not how transformation works. And we need to focus on transformation.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I would like to pivot a little bit, and I would like to direct my next question to Diana, who was not one of the leaders, but who read the book overnight, the moment she got it, and she had a lot to say about it. And one of the questions that I had for you is, in the book, the leaders, as Holly mentioned, identified 4 consistent strategies: credentials, adaptability, profile, and support. Collectively, they form the CAPS leadership framework. Which, if any of those 4 resonate with you particularly, and why? And I know you and I had a conversation about it, but based on what Michelle and Christine and Sabine just said, I think if you could also touch maybe on the generational differences as well.
First off, I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of this event, and thank you for having me. I do want to say that the support part of the CAPS framework really speaks to me, because it was the one piece of this framework that I realized was so intrinsic for success, unlike other aspects like the credentials, which were more obvious to me. Support is something that required me to really acknowledge and really accept that I need assistance. It requires a level of humility and confidence to accept that this is not about choosing work versus family, but it's finding control over your life and what you want to do. So women need to do a better job at putting ourselves higher on our list of to-dos. There are different types of support we need to consider, And I think we need to step away from this antiquated view of I can do it all. I like to think of this as finding ways to work smart versus working hard in order to preclude or to avoid burnout. And as noted in the book, the concept of support is quite multi-dimensional. Let's take, for example, the family support. I'm a litigator with a busy practice, which means I have a lot of court matters. This translates to my inability to control court-imposed deadlines. The amount of hours I work, it would be impossible to pursue my legal career I have today without the support of my husband. My spouse assumed the role of not only managing the household, this had also included childcare. I think, come to think of it, he was probably the first name on the emergency list for my daughter. Why? Because he was more readily available than me. We as a family determined that my spouse's support was an economic decision for us versus perceiving this as some sort of traditional gender role. And at no point in my career, from being an articling student to an associate and now a partner at our firm, has my husband ever questioned or resented me working late or even disappointed at missing some family events. He's supportive and understanding, and this is important. Why? Because it becomes more of a shared commitment rather than one sacrifice. And I do want to touch upon this concept of outsourced support. Now, this type of support really is about being pragmatic. It truly is about being practical. And being able to outsource support is so crucial in striking that really tough balance between family and work. Initially, I will admit I was quite reticent to considering outsourcing, as I felt it was expensive. Why not spend the weekend gardening? And I quickly learned that, for one, I don't have a green thumb, so I started outsourcing gardening. Preparing and having family meals at 9 p.m., I think I'm going to end up with a quite hangry family. And so I learned that, relying on places like HelloFresh, Uber Eats, we became best friends. And, the nanny part was not something we really had to acclimate to. It was very important. I mean, you can't do two full-time jobs, being a lawyer and raising our daughter. So I did a lot of outsourcing because it permitted me to fully focus on work when I was working. And it also permitted me time to focus on quality time with my family, which to me is priceless. I do want to touch upon this concept of organizational support, which I think is quite significant. Now, this type of support is truly cultivated by your employer, and it plays such a significant role in your professional development. For example, at our firm, Schulman and Partners, we exclusively practice in family law. We'll deal with matters that are very high-stress situations and very fast-paced. A part of our core values, or embedded within our firm DNA, is to provide flexible working arrangements. Now, this obviously predated the pandemic, but it's just not a policy that we had. We really did provide state-of-the-art technology, business communication platforms to actually put this into action for our employees. And I really do believe that mentoring our young female lawyers and assigning them high-profile matters to help the reputation is significant. We train and send our young female lawyers to actively be involved in media appearances. I mean, I was actually promoted and spearheading a team of lawyers before my maternity leave and came back into this promoted role. So coming from a divorce lawyer, I will say, choosing your employer is like choosing a life partner, in my opinion. And when there is compatibility and there's a commitment for this joint success, you will have a thriving partnership, no doubt. And your employer must be aligned with your professional goals and ambitions, or it is a failed relationship. Lastly, but very importantly, I do want to talk about the sponsorship support. I think my personal experience is quite distinct. I come from a family of 7 girls, so I have 6 sisters, no brothers. Very quickly did my father learn the rule of putting the toilet seat down in our household. My practice area is exclusively in family law, which happens to be predominantly female lawyers. At our firm, we are predominantly female. So it's safe to say that I've been around very strong, ambitious, and vocal females in my life, from childhood to adulthood. And I've had the privilege of having wonderful female mentors, but my sponsor is a male. A sponsor is someone who is at a very senior level, who takes a personal and active interest in your career advancement. And it was through his support of not just teaching me the technicals of law, but his constant providing me opportunities to excel in taking high profile and challenging files, assessing my strengths and goals, creating opportunities for me to excel, helping me recognize and capitalize on my performance versus just shelving me as lost potential was everything. And it's because of these types of what I call actually cheerleaders, or what we call a sponsor, that they don't just help you climb the corporate ladder, they help you run up the ladder. And so, based on my personal experiences, gender equity is important because as a partner of our firm, I have firsthand witnessed that successful businesses and a thriving workplace doesn't know color, creed, or gender. Really, the support element is quite fundamental in excelling.
Thank you very much, Diana. That was very inspirational. And I share your view with having a sponsor. I'm very fortunate to work where I do and work with somebody who supports my every initiative. And he's also male. And I think it's once we break through this bias of women not being capable or able, we can conquer the mountains as long as we're given the way and given the wings to fly. Christine, would you like to add to this?
Sure. Diana, I loved your comments. I'll be quick, only because I know that I'd love to hear Sabine's and Michelle's as well. But, I must say, as I look at the CAPS model, I think people might initially think that I would move to the profile and brand only because, certainly from a company perspective and honestly, managing our personal brands, even in the corporate world, was very important to me. But as I look at the CAPS model, I was going to say credentials to me, by the way, in my early part of my career was pretty critical. I actually, I went to biz school, I went to Ivy, because I wanted to have the tools, the confidence as I stepped into the business arena in order that I could build my knowledge and exposure to different industries and see different management styles and define that business acumen. And I think that for me, that laid a very good foundation and built my confidence. So I still think credentials is critical. And I was going to just layer on a little bit to what Diana said about support, and I won't repeat a lot. I loved all her detail. I'm lucky. My family, my parents both worked. They were very passionate, by the way, about their careers, and they shared it every night at the supper table. But they also, by the way, were very intrinsic in making sure and supporting and fostering that belief that I could be anything I wanted to be. And I think that's a really powerful gift. That was important. But as I moved through my business, and I had a lot of great leaders, some that I learned from and some that I learned from that I wouldn't want to emulate. But I did, I think, choose wisely on companies that I chose to work for, and also in choosing my business partner when I started Sleep Country. Steve Gunn, who is my business partner, he's my friend, he's my colleague. We shared the same values about what and the vision of what we were trying to do. And that was really critical. And as I went through those milestones of having children, as I was trying to run the company, he was really helpful and a great partner in that. And then I also want to share, like Diana had, a little bit about my husband. We're high school sweethearts. We've been married for 45 years. He's always been there to build me up when I had self-doubt. And that's really critical. He is my confidant. He is my biggest cheerleader and my best friend. So I was going to say, lucky, yes, that I had a great family. That's true. But I do think I was also responsible and really critical for choosing and trusting the people in my life that have become very important in my success. So we have control over the support system we have. It's really critical for us to think about that as we navigate within the context of our careers, including, and I loved your point about choosing companies that share our values and trying to make sure that we are aligning with our personal gyroscope, as well as building that network of people that can help us share those successes and help us when we need that build up and support.
Thank you very much, Christine. I cannot agree more. As an HR professor, I always teach my students, don't just tell them what you can do for them, but really try to gauge what they can do for you. And if there is that alignment that can result in long-term satisfactory employment, right? Michelle, would you like to add to that?
Oh, absolutely. Each of the 4 strategies really resonated with me, but in particular, I think the adaptability strategy. And as I read the book, I couldn't help but reflect on the number of times I had to moderate my natural tendencies for a situation. As Holly opened, kind of likability versus leadership. And earlier in my career, frankly, I was just told the best advice was just to act like my male colleagues. And frankly, tried that at points in time earlier in my career and found that that just wasn't going to work. And so over time, with the right level of confidence and appreciation for myself, really found the balance between just the right behavior for the right situation. But I wanted to share that because, again, each of the 4 strategies resonated with me, but that one in particular created a lot of reflection for me as I was going back through the book.
Thank you very much. Zabine?
Thanks. Yeah, happy to jump in, and I'll try to be additive and as opposed to duplicative. I do want to say a few words about profile. And in my observation, women as well as people of color, new immigrants, take this approach of, I'm going to be heads down, I'm going to get the work done, I'm going to perform really well, and that's going to speak to opportunities that are created for me. Unfortunately, that is not a winning strategy. You do have to really get comfortable with talking about your results, talking about your teams, talking about what you're doing, and actually stepping into the limelight. Because decisions and assessments and judgments about people, the reality of human nature is it's made it through very little exposure. And yes, we have objective assessments, and as a head of HR, absolutely, we brought all of those things to the table, but it's a balance. It's an art and a science in terms of what happens in organizations and how people are developed and promoted. So that's a piece of advice that I would give to people is do take the time to do it. And what I would also say, though, and you've asked us to be candid, and so I'd like to bring some of the real experiences that I've had, but also that I've observed in my 10 years as CHRO at RBC, is when women build a profile within organizations and step up and step out, one of the things that can happen is people saying, it's all about her. I didn't hear that it's all about him nearly as much, as though for women it was an unnatural act, and they were they were stepping up and stepping out into the limelight. And that's something for organizations to pay attention to, and to, I think Diana talked about, to deliberately create those opportunities for rising women to be able to step out there. And then just very practically on the support, I'd like to just kind of share 3 quick tips. Communication with partner is really important, but it's also really important with your children, because often as mothers, you feel that discomfort, that guilt. There are cultural norms that play out around, am I being a good mother? And I found, I have my children are now in their 20s, but we took the time to to say, how do you feel about your mom working full time when most of your friends at school have moms that aren't? Let's talk about it. My daughter always thanks me that it made her a very good baker because mommy didn't make the cookies for her. So there's definitely the independence there. And the other thing I would say with support, it's also support yourself, self-compassion, self-care. I didn't do that enough. It's always what we put to the bottom of our priorities, particularly as women. And don't be a perfectionist. Don't try to be everything to everyone. Set your own standards on things that don't really matter. Don't sweat the small stuff. Just let it go. I'd finally close by saying the role of fathers is not something that's talked about very much. My father at a very young age really instilled in me, and Christine, you talked about that, your parents, that I could be anything I wanted to be. He treated my brother and myself exactly the same way in terms of what we talked about and what he did with us. And he instilled in me the importance of math. Maybe that's why I went into banking. And my father passed away at 11, when I was 11, but it's still something that really, for that young age, I truly started to believe that I should not limit my own expectations just because I'm a girl.
Thank you very much, Zabine. Those are wonderful tips. Just thinking about the father figure and looking at my husband with my daughter and how much time he spends telling her that the future is yours. And you see how the confidence is building up. And you're right, we don't talk about it at all. And maybe that should also be in the forefront of our conversations. But I want to talk a little bit more about the guilt, which you mentioned, the guilt of motherly guilt. But at the same time, we experience guilt on both sides, right? We experience guilt when we're at home, we experience guilt when we're at work. And one of the learnings that emerged from COVID is that female employees, especially female employees, want and need greater workplace flexibility. And more to the point, flexibility without the guilt. So Michelle, as a former chief people officer, you offered the following quote: "It is not enough to say, as an organization, we provide flexible work arrangements and leave programs. Organizations need to really listen and empathize with their employees' personal situations and model more equitable approaches, regardless of gender. There is no point in having inclusive, family-friendly policies if people are afraid to make use of them." So how do you think can organizations make flexibility without guilt a reality? And what does flexibility look like right now when our borders between work and life are really have been eradicated due to the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, first and foremost, we need to remember that no one is operating under business as usual conditions. We're having a virtual book launch here. We continue to live through and navigate the effects of the pandemic, which has meant that issues related to childcare, elder care, personal care are wrought with added complexity. Working women have long had the burden of the double shift, but the pandemic has compounded these challenges and is creating a deep feeling of exhaustion. And as you noted, Galina, there are now no physical boundaries between the office and home for so many. So what needs to happen? Leaders and organizations, first of all, need to think much more broadly about their responsibilities for the whole human and whole health of their employees, really focusing on human-centered leadership. And this starts with ensuring that they are actively and truly listening and learning. Burdens are not borne equally across all women. And this was true before the pandemic. So the opportunity before us is to be more intentional in developing empathy, so you can better understand how best to support your employees. And that's about understanding the lived experiences. We need to create safe and brave spaces to dialogue and learn about what's getting better, what's getting worse, and how does it make people feel. With that greater empathy, Leaders and organizations then have to ask the question, do we need a set of new norms? Norms that will help employees set boundaries when the lines between office and home are blurred. The fact that someone no longer has a commute doesn't mean that they should feel like they need to be available at any hour of the day, and it shouldn't feel like they can't say no. So simple things like a norm and an expectation around what's the earliest hour in the day and the latest hour in a day when meetings will occur. Or what are the expectations around responsiveness to emails late in the evening? You know, as simple as these actions may seem, they have to be genuinely embraced and frankly role modeled by senior leadership. So many of the operating tenets and aspects of organizational playbooks were born out of the physical office setting when people left their homes and went to work. We have to rewrite these for the current virtual moments we're experiencing and the anticipated hybrid moments to come. To an extent, reconstructing how we work so life doesn't feel like a trade-off. So women in organizations aren't deciding between their careers and other important aspects of their life, but rather that they know they can be as ambitious as they want to be, and that the systems that guide decision-making in organizations, like compensation and promotions, won't work against them in the process.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I cannot agree more with the ethical leadership. In fact, in 2021, the hottest trend for HR as of today is ethical leadership. So while we are living in the tragic circumstances, there's something good coming out of it, and maybe we'll see that difference in the near future. I would like to come back to the opening questions and direct the next question to Sabine. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we'll try to speed through the questions a little bit. And my question is, despite some positive steps in what appears to be growing momentum on the gender equity front, the leaders in the book consistently voiced their disappointment with the rate of change. And Sabine, you said, we are making progress, but if we're going to achieve gender equity, that also includes intersectionality, in the foreseeable future, we need more men as allies. And to be blunt, more white men in influential leadership positions. Without the genuine and highly visible leadership of the people who hold the power, meaningful change will be glacial. So the question here then becomes, how do we inspire leaders, especially white male leaders in particular, to make gender equity strategic imperative?
Terrific, thank you. So let me try to unpack that quote because there's quite a bit in there. We've talked certainly about a lot of the data, but one of the really stark data that I'd like to add to this, and I'm sure some of you saw the picture in the Globe and Mail a couple months ago, and they had a picture of the CEOs of the TSX, the index companies. And that was a pretty stark picture. It's still online. If you're a Globe subscriber, you can get access to it. Of the 223 CEOs in the TSX index companies, 9 are women. That's 4%. Of the 1,000 NEOs, the most senior or the most highly paid officers in the named executive officers in the organization, 13% are women, and we don't even have data for that in terms of people of color. There are a lot of questions in the Q&A and the chat in terms of how this applies to other underrepresented groups. So that's a place we do need to see more data. But if you look at the picture of the CEOs, you don't really need to be a rocket scientist to see that the majority of people in that group are white males. And so the reason I say it's important and it's essential to get them involved, they are in the positions of power. They are making the decisions in terms of the talent and the acceleration of talented people into more senior roles. And so we do need to see, in my view, more of that visible leadership around women, but also around women of color. And if you just think about the numbers, Canada today is, and it's hard to figure out what the right language is. I'll be upfront around that. We've used visible minorities. We use BIPOC now, which includes Indigenous people. But if I were to look at BIPOC, that's 27% of this country and growing very rapidly. The fastest growing demographic group, actually, through immigration. And Indigenous people we have a very young population. That is a massive number, and that's a massive proportion of our population. And so I'd like to really see that visible leadership around moving the needle on that, moving it more quickly. You look at boards, 21% are women, 5.5% are visible minorities. And so, if I do the math there, although the numbers aren't reported, less than 2% of board members are women of color. And so starting to disaggregate that data, because that sort of numbers, those numbers help us measure progress, help us set accountabilities and set goals. And as people have asked again in the chat how this applies to women of color. I have a lot of women of color who say to me, Sabine, I don't see myself in that progress. I mean, certainly I had a successful career with many, barriers along the way, but I was fortunate with the sponsor. You've all talked about sponsors. Sponsors speak about, mentors speak with. Research shows men are sponsored way more than women, and people of color are sponsored way less than others. And so I say to organizations, turbocharge sponsorship, scale it. This can make a material impact. And I would also say the other piece I would say on a day-to-day is to provide more direct, consistent feedback to women and people of color around performance. There's evidence around that, and I see it anecdotally. Sometimes it's too sugar-coated. People aren't getting the feedback in time so that they can actually develop and make change. And I get the pieces around political correctness, the fear of even lawsuits, but we have to find a way to change cultures and to build that capacity to be bold enough to provide that kind of direct ongoing feedback as well as sponsorship. And that's very nicely covered in the book. So I encourage people to double click on those two areas.
Thank you very much, Sabine. You touched on quotas and you touched on numbers. And my next question, I think, ties very nicely to that. And Christine, in one of the parts of the book, which some would call controversial parts of the book, explores the value and the appropriateness of quotas for board and the C-suite participation. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Thanks, Galina. Well, I think Sabine did a very good job of setting this up as the why. To be honest, the data, there really isn't much more to say. It demands awareness. It demands that we, change the mindset and we break the cycle. There have been, I guess, significant strides, at least of awareness, I think, of equity and diversity and inclusion. Because when Paul and I first spoke, this was before the onset of COVID, which, Michelle, you did a fabulous job of talking about barriers and how businesses need to consider the difference in cultures and organizations and how we are fair to our team and also get productivity. It was before the Black Lives Matter movement. So there has been increasing, I think, dialogue on the topic, which is generating, action within organizations at board tables. I think the reason when I was asked about quotas, I think quotas and guidelines bring conscious consideration that otherwise gets overlooked and ignored. I just think it makes us all have to be at the table. The book also contends, and there's lots, and there's so much dialogue now going around that I think high-performing progressive organizations generally are more diverse. So at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do for all the reasons we've just talked about. But I think what we're seeing is it's producing better results. And that's also really important for all of us in the business community as well to understand there is benefit for that. Just, by side note, I graduated in 1982. I'm old. I was the product really of a quota consideration and the dialogue for hiring women into commercial lending at banks. And I think many of my male counterparts and colleagues were convinced that I was only hired because I was a female. And at the time, I really wanted to prove to them that was wrong, that they were wrong. And I say this because of bringing more women and more diversity, which Sabine talks so beautifully about, a quota per se, or at least at this point, the acknowledgement that businesses have to consider that. The reason I was hired was, because it was a quota, and it worked. I got my shot. I got a job. I did exceedingly well. I learned a ton. I met my future business partners. I started a company, and I've never looked back. And so, so many years ago, I'm somewhat evidence that if we start the dialogue, is important, it's working. And so, the external and internal stakeholders and advisory groups are now looking at diversity at board, at C-suite and management to gauge culture, social responsibility, and companies, I think, are demonstrating some commitment to diversity. And it's not just words, and let's hope it's not. So, I just think businesses are having to examine their hiring practices, development programs, culture, and diversity inside and at the board level. But I do think we have a very careful tightrope that we need to walk, because it's about creating this opportunity and this awareness, rewarding performance and meritocracy, and then setting someone up for success. And Michelle, you talked beautifully about that. So I think businesses are being judged. This is a good thing. It is about change. I say it's a revolution. And we just need to be mindful that as we create and open these doors, that we create a structure of support and the support systems we've been talking about in organizational structures that allow individuals, as we open the doors and give them the opportunity, that we help them be successful.
Thank you very much, Christine. We had such a rich, multifaceted discussion, and I think we all learned a lot about the issue. And I would like to wrap up. We only have a few minutes left before we're going to open for questions. I would like to ask each of you, what would be one takeaway or one piece of advice going forward to either individuals or organizations? And I know you've given a lot of advice already, but if you had to say it in one sentence, what would it be, and what does our future look like?
Many businesses welcome gender equity conceptually, but they really lack the policies and practice that would put those sentiments into action. So as we talked about today, this is not only a gendered issue, but frankly, it's a poor business decision because companies miss out or overlook very talented and people that have great merit, women that have the opportunity to excel in these businesses. I still remember in high school, which was actually in Vaughan, I was in math class and I had a female teacher who asked by show of hands, who wants to be an engineer? And majority of the boys put their hands up. And she came up to me after class and said, why don't you put your hand up? I mean, you scored over 85% in your class and you clearly have the potential. You did better than many of those boys. And this really stuck with me because from a young age, I basically implicitly understated my skill. By being overshadowed by this idea that I wasn't absolutely qualified. And this finds its way in work opportunities when men are often given the benefit of the doubt and they're promoted on potential and rather than actual performance. So this, I think, deeply entrenched perception was not just a high school experience, but it becomes quite pervasive in life. So I think that gender inequity faced at senior levels really needs to be looked at from the perspective that this is a shared responsibility for anyone taking a leadership role. It is from the top down, where current leaders need to educate their team about gender equity and stereotypes, measure these issues, and create processes to mitigate biases. It's about repairing the system and not women. The mind shift, I think, that is changed will radically impact everything. It's seeing the gender equity as a business opportunity and it being quite financially lucrative. I think it creates a paradigm shift where our representation of women and overall outcomes in the workplace really becomes groundbreaking. You said one sentence, I think I kind of went over, but.
Just a little bit. Thank you, Diana. Great advice. Michelle.
Yeah, so I'm going to build on Sabeen's comments earlier about intersectionality, and actually I love your phrase, Sabeen, turbocharged sponsorship. So my advice goes out to our white men as allies. So when you go to sponsor a woman next, because sponsorship matters, as we've talked about, if she looks like you and has had the same lived experience as you, here's my ask: sponsor 2 women and intentionally seek out somebody whose lived experience is different. And that effort, doubling down on that effort, will pay off in ways that you won't even realize today, but it goes a long way to creating opportunities for other women whose lived experiences aren't like yours. And I think it's really important to do that under the term, when you look at sponsorship. So that would be my advice.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I think the 2 terms, turbocharge and doubling down, will be in HR textbooks in about 5 years from now. And I'll make sure they are. Sabeen?
Okay, so here's what I'd say. First of all, reframe this mindset of we are taking risks on women and people of color when we're putting them into jobs. Not all males who are promoted are successful, and not all women will be successful. If every talent decision you make works out, you're not taking enough talent risk and you're not tapping into all of your potential. Number 2, I'd say disaggregate data. Women are not a homogeneous group. They look at intersectionality, Black, people of color, Indigenous, the experiences are very different, the career outcomes are different, and then take different actions based on experience, culture, and many other elements that play into it. And I'll finish off with just punctuating what Michelle talked about, which is sponsorship. There's a lot of interest, as Christina said. Can we turn this moment into a movement? What if we have 1,000 CEOs sponsor 2 women, different stages of their career, make sure they don't look, at least one of them doesn't look like them, 5,000 C-suite leaders do the same, 25,000 managers do the same. That adds up to about 50,000 sponsorees. That is doable. That is what the kind of exponential, bold change we need to see. And that's the challenge that I put out to everyone. This is the time to do it, because if not now, then when?
Absolutely. Yes, Christine, we will finish with your comment before we take the questions.
I'll be quick because I think the questions will be important to get to. Look, my advice to the individuals is that we need aspirational fortitude. And Sabeen, you talked about it. I do think we have to gird our loins. We have to want it, and we need to adapt. And I think as part of this process, finding the coping mechanisms to manage and navigate this, like CAPS framework, help. I just do. So to the individual, you got to keep working at it. It's the right goal that we're having. I like Sabeen's comment about this movement has to really happen. And only to the companies, we've talked a lot about it. I do think diversity is powerful. I think companies need to understand it's not a risk. It's an opportunity. It's the right thing to do. And it is good for business. And I do think that that'll help be a motivation at the end of the day. So those are my quick comments in that respect.
Thank you very much, Christine. We have quite a few questions. Unfortunately, we only have 10 minutes for the questions, and I would like to ask Monica if we can have 3 questions from the panel, from our audience.
While you're thinking about questions, I just want to point out to the audience that you got to listen to 3 remarkable women, 4, sorry, Diana, but from the book, 3 remarkable women talk for a few minutes. Holly and I had the distinct pleasure of having 50 remarkable women talk to us for an hour and a half. So this was a particular joy to write this book and to learn the perspectives and just to interact. So thank you, the 4 of you, for this evening, but thank you for your time throughout. It's just been a remarkable ride for Holly and me.
We have a few questions from our audience. Ken Shan Prislu asks, what implications are seen for women of color leaders? Is there other rules that would enhance a greater representation for women of color?
Well, we're waiting for people to jump in, and I'm not a woman of color, but at least had the opportunity to discuss these things. I view everything, the answer to every question in business is leadership. And this is part of why I discussed the issue of quotas. To me, quotas is not a bad thing, although we understand the negative connotations they carry. The suggestion in a quota environment is simply to give people an opportunity to do the jobs that they would have otherwise been denied of because of some factor other than being white and male. So it's not that you're giving people an opportunity that they don't deserve, you're just not denying them the opportunities that they do deserve. So it's incumbent upon the leadership group to bring the appropriate people to the table and to ensure that diversity, gender and broader diversity, happens from the top down, not to try and grow it from the roots, the grassroots up.
Thank you. We have another question from our audience. We know research and findings corroborate that women are over-mentored and under-sponsored. What is the role of the leaders in the workplace to ensure women have sponsors? What have you seen that is an interesting approach? Thank you. And the question is from Sheila Goldgrab. Panelists, anyone?
I think, to some extent, we may have covered some of that question earlier. This has been shown to really accelerate progress, sponsorship. And, ideally, sponsorship happens naturally. It's not let's have a program and have 20 women and 20 male leaders or leaders and do some sort of a matchmaking. And that means leaders spending a lot of time getting to know talent earlier in career and meeting them where they are. It's a little bit even more challenging now, actually, because we're all at home. But it's making those calls. It's reaching out. It's understanding what people are doing, what their accomplishments are, what their results are, and I have to say that for me, I have so many stories, which obviously I'm not going to get into, but it is those sponsors. It's people who said, put Sabine in that job because I see that she has some of the skills, but I bet that she's got the potential and she's going to rise to the occasion. And that started, frankly, it started when I was a teller at RBC. That's how I started my career. Very early on, where we didn't have sponsors then, there was no term sponsorship, but that's makes a huge difference. And not to overplay that, but we know how to do that. We need to be motivated to actually do that and to work. It's not going to be perfect. We have to work through the kinks. We'll make mistakes. Things won't always work out. But as I put in my chat, we went to remote work, 40% of people working from home in a week. the only reason that happened was because of the pandemic. We know we can move at COVID time. And how do we bring that same mindset and approach of learn as we go, just like we do with all of our other business decisions? And as I said earlier, not all of the staffings, the outcomes are going to work out, but nothing ever does in business. As a banker, I'd say we set goals for growth in our mortgage business, and we have provisions for loan losses. If every mortgage was paid off, we are not optimizing our investments and our returns. And we need to think of talent in the same way.
If I can jump on Zabine's comments, and I've been just absolutely overwhelmed, as I'm sure everybody who's online with us tonight, just by such inspirational stories and just such meaningful, authentic conversations. I mean, I've been inspired for the last 3-4 years that we've been working on this project, but I'm even more propelled this evening than I ever have been. But one of the things that I think that, and it's been touched on, but I'd like to reiterate, is the importance of distinguishing the difference between sponsorship and mentorship. So many of us have had experiences with formal mentoring programs, and I don't want to diminish any of that good work that our teams have been doing for years, but sponsorship is very different. And I think it's educating our CEOs and our senior leaders and our boards to understand that it is deliberate and it's meaningful. And I absolutely love the suggestion, and I think it was Michelle that you made, of saying, if you're sponsoring somebody who looks like you and acts like you, then grab another person into your, as a protege or whatever word you want to use as a mentee. But we want to really push ourselves to have different conversations with different individuals, and that's going to grow the sponsor as well. I know that some organizations do have formal sponsorship programs. I can see one of our guests tonight is from a company that does actually have a sponsorship program. It'd be interesting to hear from her in terms of the successes that they've had. But I think one of the most powerful aspects of that particular program has been in educating the leaders about what their role as a sponsor really is. It's well beyond mentorship. So I just wanted to make that contribution.
Thank you, Sabine, and thank you, Holly, for that contribution. John Oliphant asks, do you feel that the CAPS framework is equally applicable to the difficulty in advancing to top leadership positions experienced by other underrepresented groups?
Well, just from a research perspective, we can't state that definitively given the data, given that this began life as an academic exercise. What we can tell you is that people have looked at this and said, this is not a women's issue. This model applies equally well to any, for lack of a better term, marginalized group. Any group that doesn't fit comfortably within the white male power structure will probably benefit from this. They have to work harder. They have to prove themselves over again. They have to adjust their actions and adapt situationally. They have to work to build profile, and ultimately they require support. And hopefully, and this is the great thing about the CAPS model, if you view it as a staircase, is all of those things, credentials plus adaptability plus profile, leads to the likelihood of sponsorship. So if you can bring these things together, then ultimately it should work for any group. And so we anticipate that it works for any marginalized group. If there are academics out there who now want to take that study and do it for us, we'd love to see the results.
Thank you very much, Paul. We're at 7:29, and I hate to cut it short, but I would like to take the last 15 seconds to thank you all very much for joining us today. Special thank you to Paul and Holly for their devotion and the passion to the issue of gender equity, for writing this book, and for entrusting us with conducting this event. Also, thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your wisdom and vision for moving forward in bettering our society. On behalf of myself and Niagara University, it has been our absolute honor and privilege to host you tonight. And as I said in my introduction, I hope today we inched a little closer to closing the gender gap and ensuring gender equity for today's and future generations. Thank you all and good night, and we hope to see you soon.